Okay. So I want to review that we went over the 3 branches of government that was established by the Constitution. And those were created to restrain the power of each branch, that they would check so that there would remain a balance. Now I want to give some history. As you can see on the board, I've listed 18 presidents, and I wanted to show that there's a pattern that's been repeating that even started at George Washington, that the delicacy of the checks and balances have been constantly tested by each presidency. And when a president would do something, it would set a precedent for future presidents. And it's been said that once power is given to a branch of the government, they rarely give it back. So I'm also using references from the Imperial Presidency by Arthur Schlesinger. If you want to, it's a really good book. Look at that. So to define an imperial presidency, which is the unitary executive power, it would be a presidency that relies on powers beyond those allowed by the Constitution of the United States. So again, the 3 branches were established not for efficiency, but to avoid the arbitrary exercise of power. So we have seen through various means that presidents have acquired powers beyond the limits of the Constitution. There's no daily accountability. It happens every 4 years. That the change has been slow. In fact, what we consider normal would be, if you go back 100 years, would look vastly different. So I would like to start with George Washington, our first president of the United States. And I want to give a list of different things that each president did to show these patterns and to bring us to where we are now with Donald Trump. The first thing President Washington did was he sent emissaries overseas without legislative approval. So here we have the first president exercising his presidential power, but without Congress. Then in 1793, he formally announced a proclamation of neutrality. He unilaterally, by himself, as an imperial president, as a unitary executive president, determined that the new American Republic would remain neutral in the war between Britain and France during the French Revolutionary Wars. His main reason was economics. He wanted to continue trading with France and Britain. And so he continued, the ships kept going out, and they were eventually captured by both of those countries. So the proclamation, what did it do? It threatened legal proceedings against any American citizen who provided assistance to any country at war. This angered the American people greatly because they had been helped by the French, and they wanted to reciprocate that help. So the proclamation did not go over well. And he insisted, President Washington insisted, that the power to make such a determination resides in the president, This then created a precedent that future presidents would use. However, because it's a proclamation, it is not a law, and the grand juries refused to enforce the proclamation. Another event that happened during his presidency was his Secretary of State, which was an old friend. There were rumors that he had taken a bribe from a French envoy, and he dismissed him without congressional approval. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it say a president can dismiss an official that has been approved by the Senate. But it does say in Article 1 that the Senate will approve the appointees that the president picks. So logic would say, well, if they have to be approved to work there, then the Senate would have to approve their dismissal. But that's not what happened. He tied his administrative system of unitary executive power to dismiss these officials to his office. During the last 2 years of his presidency, he was mockingly offered a crown because of the actions that he took in his presidency. So he had become very unpopular in the last few years, and it was basically newspapers that were loyal to Jefferson that were doing these character assassinations. So the next president is John Adams. We spoke about him in the previous presentation about the Alien and Sedition Acts. And interestingly, he did get congressional approval for this act, but the Congress was on his side. It was in the favor of the president that they passed this act. And it was to silence the objectors, the Democratic Republicans, and Thomas Jefferson. I had spoken about that there were 4 acts. The Naturalization Act, which changed the residency requirements from 5 years to 14 years, which then greatly diminishes the ability for immigrants to vote in upcoming elections. The Alien Act, which Congress authorizes the president to deport aliens that were determined to be dangerous or a threat to the peace and safety of the nation. And of course, this determination is made by the president. The Alien Enemies Act, this permitted the arrest and imprisonment and deportation of aliens from enemy countries. So if you are at war with a specific country and you are an immigrant in this country, you can be deported, which is very similar to what happened. Well, I'll get to that later. I'll talk about that later. And then the 4th act is the Sedition Act. Any action deemed by the government to be treason included the publication of any material judged to be false, scandalous, or malicious, and it was punishable by a fine and imprisonment. 20 editors of newspapers were arrested and their businesses shut down. The public opposition was so great that it helped to get Thomas Jefferson elected in 1800. Once Jefferson was in office, he pardoned everybody that was arrested, and Congress restored the fines with interest. So here's an example of a framer of the Constitution, John Adams, who believed it gave him and Congress the power to silence the people when the people disagreed with him. And this is our first two presidents, we're already seeing the cracks in our three branches. So the Congress worked in alliance with the president for a joint goal of silencing these people. So Thomas Jefferson was elected. So in 1801, America learned that Spain had agreed to return Louisiana to France. At that time, New Orleans was a major economic port area for the economy of the United States, along with the Mississippi River. So Jefferson, he wanted to buy that land, he wanted it now. So he quickly sent a special envoy to France to negotiate a purchase. The envoys accepted France's offer of over 800,000 acres of land for $15 million, even though the envoys had been given a mandate of only to spend $10 million. They negotiated the treaty, came to an agreement, and the envoys returned to the United States. And on July 4th, they announced the treaty that they were going to get Louisiana purchased. And this was done in 1803, July 4th, 1803. Congress had not approved it yet, but here it is being signed and announced before Congress. Now, interestingly, Jefferson had reservations about the constitutionality of being able to buy territory from a foreign country. And he argued that an amendment to the Constitution was necessary, and he even drafted one. But his cabinet members argued against the need, and the Congress actually disregarded his draft. So here's a president trying to stay within the confines of the Constitution, and the Congress doesn't. So again, we see another crack. The treaty was finally ratified in October of 1803. James Monroe. Everyone's heard of the Monroe Doctrine. So there were several revolutions against Spanish rule in South and Central America. The United States quickly recognized these new established countries. There was concern of a strong possibility that European governments would intervene and then reassert their control over those colonies in South and Central America. So President Monroe declared the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, declaring that from this point forward, America is the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. So already we're creating spheres of influence and working our way into becoming a global power. And it had the nerve to warn Europeans that interference in the Americas would not be tolerated. The Monroe Doctrine is not a law. It is merely a declaration of a presidential policy. But Monroe felt he was authorized to establish a foreign policy that commits the United States to military action without a declaration of war by Congress. Remember, that is the sole power of the House of Representatives, to make a declaration of war. So the Constitution and its authors determined that the power to initiate the war belonged to Congress. The president had the responsibilities to conduct ongoing wars and ongoing foreign relations, and to respond to sudden attacks if Congress were not in session. But as we see here, the United States was becoming a world power, and then it's working its way to become a superpower. And through the years, the presidency has acquired more war powers despite the Constitution. This has reduced Congress's powers and the separation of powers, which is necessary to avoid the arbitrary use of power. Next, we have James Polk. He actually sent troops to an area between Texas and Mexico in 1846, because during that time there was a lot of discussion and debate about annexing Texas, and James Polk wanted to do that. So he provoked a war, and then he manipulated the Congress into recognizing a state of war. At that time, there was a representative in the House, and his name was Abraham Lincoln. And he stated that if this was allowed, a president could arbitrarily make war just as the monarchs do, and that the Constitutional Convention recognized that declaring war must not be in the hands of one man. So now that Representative Lincoln is now President Lincoln, the very statement that he made to James Polk, President Polk, he's now using for himself. During the American Civil War, Lincoln assumed war powers as commander-in-chief of the military. He literally invented presidential war powers in 1861. But he made no claim that the Constitution allowed him these powers. Without congressional authorization, Lincoln unilaterally expanded the military. He suspended habeas corpus, which means if you're arrested, you have to be told why you're being arrested and have the proof that it's a valid reason, which he was defying the Chief Justice when he suspended the habeas corpus. He also arrested citizens and tried them in military courts. He proclaimed martial law. He seized property. He censored newspapers, and he emancipated the slaves, all without congressional authority. Excuse me. Lincoln justified the actions as necessary to preserve the country rather than by the Constitution. So he claimed, I may, in an emergency, do things on military grounds, excuse me, which cannot be done constitutionally by Congress. So we see again here how presidents take on these things that they believe are within their authorization. The other thing so he set a precedent for future presidents. He also stated that the presidential war powers would cease to exist once the national emergency, which was the Civil War, would end. After the Civil War, the Supreme Court in 1866 asserted that the Constitution was the law of the land in war and in peace, and that government powers cannot exceed those granted by the Constitution. So in 1867, the Supreme Court stated that the president must carry out the law and may not break the law. It was then, following the Civil War, that presidential power was deflated. Next is William McKinley. With the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States had become a great power, and presidential power expanded. In 1900, President William McKinley sent 5,000 troops to China, which was during the Boxer Rebellion, for political purposes, again, without congressional approval. Theodore Roosevelt, He sent troops to Caribbean countries and established new governments in several of those countries without congressional approval. So we see a continued pattern and an increase of presidential power. Franklin Roosevelt. In 1939, after the start of World War II in Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared a limited national emergency. So the concept of a limited national emergency seems to rest on implied and assumed powers of the president and the assertion of it by him. So it starts out as a limited national emergency in 1939, but then in 1949, he determined that the nation was in a state of unlimited national emergency. And then Congress in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, they end the national emergency. Now, I'd like to define for you what the national emergency powers is defined as. The president may seize property and organize and control the means of production, seize commodities, steel, manufacturing companies. He can assign military forces abroad, institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate the operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and in a variety of ways, control the lives of United States citizens. So we've seen throughout history, the history of the presidency, that a pattern has emerged that the president assumed greater powers during the emergency. I believe there's currently 34 national emergencies still on the books for the United States. And they all have to do with various war on terror. And I think if you use Wikipedia, you can find a list of them, of all the national emergencies that have been called for, those who have ended, and the ones that are still in effect. So after the emergency has passed, Congress would assert itself. And that occurred after the Civil War and World War I. But interestingly, after World War II, Congress did not assert itself as much anymore because of the Cold War. And now we come to Harry Truman. In 1950, Truman had sent troops to the Korean War without congressional approval. In 1952, Truman feared a national strike by the steel industry would impair the military's ability to fight the Korean War. So he ordered his Secretary of Commerce to seize and operate the steel mills without congressional approval. So it makes you wonder, where is Congress when all of this is happening? The pattern that I see is that if the Congress is the same political party as the president, you don't see much resistance. The Supreme Court, however, did their due diligence and did judicial review and found that those actions were unconstitutional. You cannot apply the national emergency of the Constitution to domestic matters. By 1952, Truman had increased the armed services to 3.6 million, and that by itself resulted in an increase of presidential power. Before then, Only Lincoln had increased the army without congressional approval. On top of that, there were an additional 50 treaties, which increased presidential responsibilities and power in the 1950s. The CIA, which is one of the agencies within the executive branch and which answer only to the president, so under his direction, they overthrew the governments of Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. They also attempted, but failed, to overthrow the government of Indonesia. The CIA also installed a new government in Egypt in 1954. And the CIA also helped organize Cuban refugees to overthrow the Cuban government. All of this was done without congressional approval. So they say the presidency's control of foreign policy has vastly increased. And this is I see this as the global growing of a superpower, of increasing spheres of influence. So while the president's control of foreign policy is increasing, it's also decreasing the constitutional separation of powers. In the decade after the Korean War, most liberal and conservative members of Congress agreed on presidential control of foreign policy. That was totally new.
That was under Truman. That was under
Truman.
Truman.
Next is Lyndon Johnson. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson sent 22,000 troops to the Dominican Republic without congressional approval. The same year, he sent combat troops for the first time into Vietnam. That war was the longest in the US history and resulted in the fourth largest number of US casualties after the Civil War and the two World Wars. There was a resolution passed called the Tonkin Gulf, and it authorized the president to use the military as he required. So Lincoln had believed that if a president could bring the country to war, he held the power of a king. So the passing of this resolution of the Tonkin Gulf had made the president into a king because he was allowed to use the military as he required, basically transferring the war powers from Congress to the president. Next, we have Richard Nixon. In 1970, Richard Nixon ordered an intervention into Cambodia without congressional approval. By 1971, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was revoked by Congress. However, the Vietnam War continued solely from Nixon's authority. He totally, utterly ignored Congress, who had revoked that authority given to him. He claimed he had war powers because he's the commander-in-chief of the military. Before Lincoln, that title indicated only the topmost officer of the armed forces. Lincoln used it for greater authority so it could help future presidents in the event of a civil war. So they have now taken what President Lincoln had done by claiming to be the commander-in-chief as a civilian. They could now take that same title and use it to do military events. Nixon justified his authority to the invasion of Cambodia only by the title of commander-in-chief. That title has so much breadth of power. And Congress is not holding on to their power, sets a very dangerous precedent. So Cambodia and Laos were both supposed to be neutral countries, but they were being used as a base of operation by the North Vietnamese and the Vietcong. Laos, L-A-O-S, Laos, was bombed from 1964 to 1973. This information was kept secret from Congress. How do you do that? If it's kept secret from Congress, and I mean, how do you have a war going on and they don't know that this is happening? In 1971, Congress passed an amendment to the Defense Spending Bill to terminate all military operations in Indochina, which is Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. Nixon signed that defense spending bill, but he continued fighting in Vietnam. Under Nixon, Congress had no war powers. By 1971, Congress discovered 7 secret bases and 32,000 troops were in Thailand, after he had already been told not to continue these wars. He had also made defense agreements with Thailand, and the federal government was secretly funding an Ethiopian army, all without Congress's knowledge or approval. And for a treaty to become in effect, the Constitution requires a 2/3 approval of treaties by the Senate. So again, Nixon took it upon himself to negotiate treaties and put them in force without Congress. So the imperial presidency was created in response to foreign policy issues. This resulted in the exclusion of the Congress, the press, the public, and the Constitution in foreign policy decisions. So once established, the imperial presidency goes from foreign policies, it now expands into domestic issues. So starting in 1947, presidential power over the federal budget, with slight modifications by Congress, gave the president important controls over the economy and social priorities. So we already see now, we can see the branches are getting stripped of their powers, except the president is taking the power from the branches and it's cracking. So the economic powers were used to reward economic sectors that supported the actions of the president. How often have we seen that in the current presidency? Those who show their loyalty are rewarded with positions in his administration. Those who show loyalty are given funding for projects, etc. So Nixon, he would also punish those who opposed him, just like Trump is doing. And then rather than veto congressional legislation that he opposed, he would simply impound the funds. So the only option the Constitution allows if the president opposes a law is to veto it. The Constitution empowers the Congress to determine the level of spending, not the president. So here we have a president who is selectively enforcing the laws. It wasn't until 1973 that Congress reasserted its authority after Watergate. They tried to limit FBI and CIA activities through the Church Committee investigations of the mid-1970s. At that time, Nixon was using the agencies to investigate his enemies and to cause difficulties and problems for them. And another thing that the Congress did was pass the Ethics in Government Act to create special prosecutors to investigate accusations of illegal activities in the executive branch. Unfortunately, these actions did not have the impact many in Congress had hoped for. The War Powers Act was ignored by future presidents who intervened regularly without giving notice under the law. And the Church Committee investigations had no substantial long-range impact. So now we start, and that was just a brief list of the things that Richard Nixon did. In fact, all of these are just a few things that I pulled out, but if you do a study on each president, you'll be able to find more information about how they governed while they were president. So our next president is Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan promoted himself as a conservative, and his goal was making the federal government smaller. But he actually expanded the power of the presidency, not through law, but through precedent. And because his substantial unilateral actions were not challenged, he set a precedent, a pattern, an ability for future presidents to follow in his steps. This was particularly evident in foreign policy, most notably the Iran-Contra affair. At that time, Congress had banned any involvement or intervention in the civil war raging in Nicaragua against the leftist Sandinista government. But Reagan's administration nevertheless arranged secret arms sales to Iran, and then used that money from those sales of weapons to support the anti-government Contras in Nicaragua. So some members of Congress actually called for impeachment proceedings. It was avoided because the only reason it was avoided was because Reagan was in his second term, and it was his final term, and because he has a warm personality and he's very popular with the people. So we see in the beginning of our prophetic line in the 1989 that there's impeachment. And Reagan also used his executive power to authorize a secret intervention in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And so that fits right in our line. He supported Iraq and Saddam Hussein in their war against Iran, and simultaneously sold weapons to Iran. Next one is George Bush Sr. He also intervened internationally without congressional authority. He authorized the invasion of Panama in 1989. He organized a coalition to force Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait during the brief Persian Gulf War of 1991. And he did not seek a congressional declaration of war. He simply gained an authorization to use force. Bush, with his Attorney General, William Barr, that name should be familiar to us. That's also President Trump's Attorney General. So Bush pardoned the major figures who had been convicted or were still facing trial as part of the Iran-Contra scandal. And I think it was 6 people who were eventually pardoned, and high up officials. This also prevented any further investigation of the possibility that Bush himself was involved in that scandal. And so now we have Bush is following in Reagan's footsteps. He continued to take unilateral action in foreign policy, and he acted to ensure that Reagan never was held responsible for his presidential actions, thus confirming that the presidential powers had expanded. Okay, the next one we have is Bill Clinton. So once the Republican opposition gained control of both houses of Congress in the midterms of 1994, interestingly, the Republicans were less supportive of unchecked presidential power of a Democrat. And this is one of the other patterns we can see. And I haven't put that together, but it's easily discernible. So while they were unconcerned about presidential power under Reagan and Bush, they complained that Clinton abused executive orders on domestic issues, including the environment. Clinton was also heavily investigated and even impeached over his personal behavior with women. So now we have George W. Bush Jr. He came to power after a contested presidential election of 2000. He brought in Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And it was after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, that Cheney and Rumsfeld used national security concerns to justify the use of surveillance and enhanced interrogation techniques, torture. The Patriot Act was then passed with very few dissenting votes, and the Department of Homeland Security was created. So here again, we have a Republican president, and we have an emergency, September 11th. And now we have all these expanding powers being approved by Congress, further empowering the executive branch. The decision to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq was based on faulty information. This caused some to call for an impeachment of George Bush Jr. And a bill was actually introduced by Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio, along with Robert Wexler of Florida in 2008. The charges lodged against Bush in the impeachment resolution included accusations that Bush had misled the nation on the need for the invasion of Iraq, his conduct of the Iraq War, the treatment of detainees, the National Security Agency warrantless surveillance, and failure to comply with congressional subpoenas. However, Democratic Speaker Nancy Pelosi resisted any movement toward an impeachment because Bush was coming to the end of his second term, just like Reagan. Barack Obama. So once the Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives in the midterm 2010 elections and control of the Senate in the 2014 midterm elections, the Republicans worked mightily to attempt to block the agenda of the new president, Barack Obama. Republicans argued that Obama was abusing his power with excessive use of executive orders on issues such as the creation of numerous commissions and boards and committees and task forces, along with Obama's actions on environmental protections, his healthcare actions, and his initiatives on opening up relations with Cuba and authorizing the Iran deal to prevent nuclear development. The Republicans further curtailed his agenda as they refused to even consider the nomination of Merrick Garland to replace Anton Scalia on the Supreme Court after his death in 2016, and he also prevented other judicial confirmations to the lower courts. Has enabled the Republicans to hold open hundreds of vacancies of judges all across the nation. And at this point, I think Donald Trump has now appointed almost 300 judges. And of course, they're conservative. Interestingly, so we have the Republicans against the Democratic president. But interestingly, Obama's administration was scandal-free, and no cabinet officers or other high-ranking figures were indicted or convicted for corruption, which had been endemic under Reagan and the second Bush in particular. There was one thing they actually also accused him when he said regarding immigration, that if Congress didn't do something, he would take matters into his own hand. And you can understand now why he said that, because they were not working with him on anything. Everything he did, he hit a brick wall. And if he tried to use every ability possible within the executive branch to get things passed for the benefit of the people of this nation. Okay, and then we have Donald Trump. The list was way too long to discuss the things that he has done, but I'm sure, like good students of prophecy, everybody knows, you've been reading the newspapers and hearing the news over what he's said and done. So, so Trump has made the controversies under Republican presidents Reagan and the two Bushes, they look minor in comparison. Some even consider his abuse of power as more scandalous than the presidency of Richard Nixon. So there's the concern over the Russia collusion in the election in 2016, Trump's violation of the emoluments clause, which is he's making money every time a foreign emissary or there's a meeting held at his Trump hotels. He's also the abuse of power, the obstruction of justice, and the massive corruption and incompetence of so many cabinet officers and other high officials under Trump, which make him seem unfit for office. The crisis is greater than Watergate in many respects because Trump has made it clear he will not cooperate with any congressional committee on demands for evidence and witnesses. He has jokingly asserted the right to an extra 2 years as president because he believes he has been mistreated in his first 2 years due to the Robert Mueller investigation. And his Attorney General, William Barr, the same man who assisted George Bush Sr. in his move toward blanket pardons in 1992, is also refusing to give congressional committees the entire Mueller report without redactions, which means they're claiming executive privilege. You can't know about this. And now Trump has declared he will not cooperate on any legislative actions by Congress until the witch hunt he sees against him comes to an end. Trump's withholding of $391 in Senate-approved aid to Ukraine has violated the Impoundment Control Act. $391 million. When Congress refused the president's request for funds to build the wall on the southern border, what did Trump do? He actually took money from other parts of the government, which was later declared illegal by a federal judge. Trump's team kept the whistleblower complaint from Congress as well, and a clear obligation, despite a clear obligation to hand it over. He has also refused to fill crucial vacancies within the executive branch, leaving the Federal Election Commission unable to take any enforcement actions for violations of federal campaign laws in the lead up to the 2020 election. Let's unpack that a little bit. He's left vacancies in the executive branch, which means there's positions for officials, and it's the Federal Election Commission. So they're not able to take any enforcement actions for violations of federal campaign laws. Rather than making formal appointments and soliciting the Senate's advice and consent, as the Constitution requires for top-tier officials, Trump has found a new way to bypass the Congress, the Senate. What he does is he installs temporary appointees in key posts in his administration. So they would have the title acting Attorney General or acting Department of Homeland Security Director. That then prevents him from having to get Senate approval, but he's able to appoint the person he wants. So one of the founding principles of the Republic was that the federal military should not be involved in domestic law enforcement. Trump recently claimed authority based on the 1807 Insurrection Act, which is only used in natural disasters or riots, and it's as requested by the governors. So again, he's claiming this authority that he does not have. In 1956, President Eisenhower passed another provision of an act stating that if unlawful activities make it impractical to enforce the laws of the United States, he may call in the armed forces. And interestingly, in 1957, Eisenhower sent in military troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to help with the desegregation of public schools. So Trump is using his executive powers to attempt to reverse all of Obama's accomplishments in office, and that of many other presidents in the past century. Think about it. He's unraveling everything that's ever been done. This is unchecked presidential power that has never seemed more of a threat. There is a constitutional crisis coming. There's been a transforming of the presidency and a destroying of the separation of powers and checks and balances created by the founding fathers in 1787. So in summary, the framers thought that the three branches would remain co-equal and that it would maintain the Constitution's delicate balance. But over time, the executive branch has become the dominant branch. And this unbalancing contributes to the political polarization of the people. In 1787, the framers created a strong executive to replace a weaker leadership structure that the Articles of Confederation had provided. But what they did is they created a strong Congress as the first and most important branch of the government. They expected that the president would occasionally check the democratic enthusiasm of Congress as part of his mission to uphold the Constitution and execute the law. But they attempted to ensure that the work of democracy would happen mainly through the legislative work of that first branch. In other words, they gave us a congressional government. But yet over time, the president has become the main agent within US democracy. Presidential government has replaced congressional government. It's an unbalancing of the framers' design, and it's a hard one to stop. The executive office accrues unprecedented, unconstitutional power